inspiration for my work comes from the natural phenomena that surround us in our daily lives, like a gust of wind or a ray of sunlight or the way water flows. I'm interested in, as an artist, in visualizing these things that we are all quite familiar with, but maybe sometimes take for granted or don't think about so much. For me, they also pose artistically a very interesting challenge, because how can I photographically record a gust of wind, for instance, or how can I try to create an image of sunlight itself? So those kind of questions are at the heart of my practice, my artistic interests, and that's what I make work about. So my work starts always with these kind of questions of how do I visualize or photograph wind, or how can I try and capture sunlight in a photograph. And these questions often lead me to experts on these topics, and those I can find in the scientific world. So I consult with experts, with scientists, or I invite myself over to scientific institutions to inform myself on the topics that I'm interested in. So this really is the start of the work, to do the field research and to ask the questions, to get into dialogue and exchange with scientists on the topics that I'm interested in. And eventually the information that I get, I transform into experiments myself. So I build models, I try to create experimental setups, and I create all these things that I put somehow in front of the camera or behind the lens, and that is the basis of the work that I make. Yes, so the current studies are a series of experiments which I carried out from 2013 to 2016. And the basic question was, how can I capture wind in a photograph? And I went to the Dutch Meteorological Institute to talk to people there. I went to a laboratory in Delft to see how people work with aerodynamics. And I gathered lots of information and used that information to create my own sets. And I did that here in my studio in Amsterdam, and I used kind of simple materials that I could find around me, like plastic sheets, or used fans or leaf blowers to generate wind, and I worked with smoke and with dry ice to try and visualize somehow a flow of air, a current. And this I did several of these experiments. It amounted to an entire series of works, and each time I was trying to look for a balance between, you know, the visible reference which I needed to visualize this flow of air, and the invisible subject, which was the wind, because we cannot photograph, we cannot actually see wind, but how can you make it somehow perceivable in a photograph? That was really the challenge for me. I first came to Fur in the summer of 2017. Christiane Morsbach, the curator and organizer of the artist residency of the museum, she got in touch with me and invited me to come to the island, to stay there and work there for some time. She had seen my current studies work and was interested to see if I could work on the island as well. I thought it was an interesting question, but I had never done an artist residency before, and I was really not so sure what I could do myself on the island, because normally I work in a studio, in a controlled environment, and now I had to see if I could work externally at a different location and work with the location. So at first I really wasn't sure how to approach it. And I thought, well, at least I take something with me. And at the time I was interested in and doing research on the nature of sunlight. So I was reading about Newton's experiments with sunlight and how it's broken into the different colors of the spectrum. And I was building a camera myself, a camera obscura, with which I could sort of recreate this experiment, but then in a photographic way, and also to record it. So I took this big camera obscura with me to Fur, and in the garden of the residency, I worked with the sunlight at the time, and developed basically the project which became Exploded Views. And later, in 2018 and 2020, I returned to the island to work on new work. So the exhibition at the Museum Kunst der Westküste basically brings together quite a large overview of works that I've made in the past 8 years or so. And these fall apart in sort of 3 interests. One is the work which I've done about the wind, the second with the sunlight, and the third with more recent work that I created on the island with climate change and the ways in which scientific community is now thinking about countering the effects of climate change. I first heard about it a few years ago, and the correct term is called solar geoengineering, and it is based on this idea that we artificially change the climate. I spoke to a professor at the university here in the Netherlands, in Delft, about this topic early 2020, and he tried to explain to me what this technique actually entails, and also we talked about the controversy of this technique. It was a very interesting conversation. I learned a lot in a short amount of time, and I was specifically interested in a technique which they call stratospheric aerosol injection, which basically means that we would cool the climate or cool the planet by reflecting sunlight back into space. And the techniques that are proposed to do so are, for instance, one of those is to put a layer of aerosols, of tiny white particles, into the upper atmosphere and the stratosphere, where they would reflect sunlight back into space. So sunlight that doesn't hit the planet actually cannot warm the planet, thus cools it. But as you can imagine, it's a technique which is controversial because it's artificially changing the climate on a global scale. So there are lots of risks involved, which are currently under research. And so it's an interesting topic to me to think about. And I also thought that it could be interesting because it's something that is quite large to think of, and we don't have any visual ideas of what that might look like. And so I thought that could be my point of entry, that I could try, because it only exists as an idea, as a theoretical model, I could try and do this experiment myself. And that was kind of the start of the Elements work. So what we did on Fur to create this work, well, first I had to come up with an idea of how to get these aerosols into the atmosphere. And after some experiments with different techniques, I settled on this pipe to shoot it up into the air. We worked on the beaches, we worked on the Wat, really in the mud, and to see how these different clouds form when we shoot the matter up in the air, because it really is this very short moment, this explosion that happens, and this moment where you capture that cloud that is carried away by the wind very quickly. So the work is made on fur because I feel it has a specific connection to this place. Fur is a part of the larger Wadden Sea. It's a Wadden Island, and this is a very low-lying territory in northern Europe. So if sea levels actually start to rise, low-lying places like Fur, but also the Netherlands where we are now, will be affected very soon. And so it felt really quite logical to do an experiment to counter climate change in one of the places that would be affected by it quite soon. For me, it was really interesting to work on the island. For the first residency that I did there, I wasn't really sure how to approach working outside because I'm quite used to working inside a studio, or let's say in a controlled environment where all the parameters of the work and the experiments that I do are in my control, under my control. And this was not the case on the island because I devised the idea, the experiment, and but I did it outside, working with the elements of the island. And at first, the first couple of tries that we did, it was really interesting because I was maybe a little bit stressed of this is never going to work because the wind is too strong, or there's too much rain, and it will never really work. But I found out quickly enough that when I persisted and kept going back, it actually brought me something else, which is that the elements really started to inform the experiment that I did. So it is actually really beautiful and interesting to see the difference in wind, or to see the difference in light, or the climate actually affecting the experiment rather than the other way around. And that for me was an interesting insight as an artist.